Did you know that knitting has been tied back all the way to ancient Egypt in 1000 AD? That's over 1,000 years that people have been knitting. I myself have only been knitting since the 4th grade, but since then I've made anything from hats to scarves to currently a blanket. Knitting is a very important life skill because of all the practical applications it has and its very calming psychological effect. When starting a knitting project, you will need a ball of yarn and 2 knitting needles. The very first thing you'll learn how to do is how to cast on, which is basically how to attach your yarn to your knitting needles. You'll start off by making a slip knot. You will take the short end and calculate how long you want your piece to be. This will be the width of your entire project, and that's where you want to make your slip knot. Your slip knot will be made by taking the short end, crossing it behind the long end, which is connected to the ball of yarn, moving it to the front and the inside. So now you've created a loop inside of your larger loop. And then you'll wrap it behind the larger loop and pull it tight. Then simply take your first knitting needle and pull your slip knot tight around it. Now you have one end, which will be the width of your project, and the second end, which is connected to your ball of yarn. Now you have to add however many stitches you want your project to be. This is the width. So to do this, you will take the short end of the yarn in your left hand. Grab it with your fist like this so your thumb is available. Loop it around your thumb, and then take your knitting needle and insert it through the loop. Okay? And then with the long end of the yarn, you will loop it around the knitting needle, and then you will pull the knitting needle through the loop again, release it, and pull it tight. And now we have 2 stitches. Now that you have casted on however many stitches you want on your project, you can finally start knitting your project. Now you will use your second knitting needle. You will take your first stitch on your first knitting needle and loop your second knitting needle through it. And then with the yarn, the long end of the yarn connected to your ball of yarn, you will loop that around your second knitting needle, and this will simply split the stitch into 2 different sections. Now, this is your first section on your first knitting needle and your second section on your second knitting needle. You'll take your second knitting needle and loop it backwards through that first section. And then you can pull that stitch off of your first knitting needle and tighten it. And that is your first stitch. Now, after you have knit for quite a while, this is roughly 10 rows for my example, this is the pattern which you will start to see. And once you get the desired length of your project, you will start to do what is called casting off, which is the final step of your project. To cast off, you will knit twice, and then you will have 2 stitches on your second knitting needle. You will take, with your first knitting needle, loop it through your first loop and loop it over your second stitch. So now you only have 1 stitch on your second knitting needle. Then you will knit again. And once again, take your first stitch and loop it over your second stitch. And you'll keep doing this all the way down your project until you get to the very end. And that is your first project. This is just an example, but you get the idea. I would recommend, if you are a beginner, this is my very first book of knitting. It is Teach Me to Knit by Leisure Arts. It's what I use to get all my information for this presentation today, but it's very useful, and it has several beginner things to start with, like coasters, and it works you up to making gloves and sweaters and pillows and stuff like that. All you need is simply 2 knitting needles and some yarn, and you can make whatever your heart's desire.